Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Way with Maps. I'm your host, Maps, aka Javier, and today is the long-awaited episode, the episode I've been planning for a very long time. We have Dr. Eberhard in the room with us, and we're going to be talking about language and the science of language. So, Dr. Eberhard, feel free to introduce yourself.
Oh, thank you, Javier. Yes, I'm Dr. Eberhard. I am a member of the Cognition, Brain, and Behavior Department in the Psychology Department at Notre Dame.
Yes, perfect. So I met with Dr. Eberhard before Thanksgiving break, and we were able to have a really good conversation about a lot of the questions I had, and kind of like what I'm looking to do here is have a very similar type of conversation. Some of the stuff we might repeat because I want to put that out to the listeners. So one of the things we talked about was how, I guess the first thing that I brought up was how I saw I managed to detect kind of how similar or the same sounds were used to convey different were used in across different letters. So the example that we spoke about was a lot of my friends, so I'm bilingual, speak Spanish and English, and a lot of my friends were talking to me about how they were having difficulty rolling their R's, and I described it to them as kind of a D sound, the D sound in English. And so excuse me, sorry. And so kind of that is what how kind of allowed them to help them pronounce the letters. And I guess I was just kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit about. I remember that you pulled up a chart.
Right. Yeah. So in the branch of linguistics, referred to as phonology as well as phonetics, the sounds of all languages have been defined or described in terms of various feature dimensions. And so your observation that the rolling sound of the r sound, which is a trill, is very similar to the d sound that we associate with the letter D, is quite accurate. So it involves two of the features that are involved in the articulation of d, namely the voicing of the vocal folds. If you put your fingers over your vocal fold region in your neck and you say duh, you can feel the vocal fold vibration. And duh involves stopping the airflow by taking the tip of your tongue and touching it to a ridge called the alveolar ridge right behind your upper teeth. In the case of a trill, like the r sound, instead of stopping the airflow, you're sort of flapping the tip of your tongue against that alveolar ridge. So it's quite similar in terms of the articulation.
Right, and it was pretty interesting to me, particularly to see, I guess, you had a whole software that kind of showed a different chart with, like you mentioned, the different, trill sounds and how they were pronounced, in different, how they were used across different languages. And you mentioned as well that, having, familiar, having those having for example a trill in the language that you speak, or your first language, and then when you switch to another language and you're learning another language, you can sometimes have difficulty if there is no trill.
Right. Yeah. So one factor that affects becoming sort of native-like proficient in a foreign language or a second language involves your capacity to both perceive and produce contrasts between sounds in that foreign language. And difficulty arises when the foreign language contains two sounds that don't exist in your native language, but one of those sounds is quite similar to one that does. So the problem is that the single sound in your native language represents basically a category that would subsume the contrast between the two sounds in the foreign language, and it turns out that creates difficulty because it requires you to pay attention to a dimension that's been irrelevant for producing your native language, but is relevant to distinguishing two sounds in the foreign language. So the classic example of this is there's a sound in Japanese that's very similar to the sound in English, but Japanese doesn't contain the sound, which we associate with L. And so their sound that's similar to sort of includes the category, and making it very difficult for them to perceive or hear a difference between the English and sound, and hence they might pronounce words like Levi's as Revi's. So they would substitute the single category sound in their native language for both of the different sounds in English.
Right. Yeah, and that's pretty interesting. We also talked about when we were talking about pronunciations in different languages. I remember that I was talking about how I had it was weird to me how English, like written English, kind of worked even though I've been exposed to it for so long, because I know that in Spanish we use like accents to like help with a lot of the pronunciation. Kind of when you're reading in Spanish, you'll have an accent that'll tell you like what like syllable to stress. Mm-hmm. And you spoke about how in English there's a lot of correct me if I'm wrong, but it was like in English there's a lot of like words that are stressed in the same way, like coffee or cell phone in that way.
Yeah, so that has to do with the fundamental difference between, say, the Germanic languages and Romance languages, which are syllable-based languages. So unlike the Moray in Japanese, which is differs in the structure than syllables. So in syllable languages, like the Germanic and the Romance languages, there's a difference in the rhythmic structure of these languages. So Romance languages are syllable-timed languages. What that means is that if you listen to an utterance and you find the points of greatest stress, there will be an equal number of syllables between those points of highest stress. Whereas in the Germanic languages, there'll be a variable number of syllables between those 2 points, but the duration of time between them will be constant, normalized for the overall speech rate. So as a consequence, in English and other Germanic languages, when you have multisyllabic words, not all of them, but many of them, particularly nouns, tend to be stressed on their initial syllables, whereas that won't necessarily be true in syllable time languages like the Romance languages. And so non-native speakers of English, but native speakers of a Romance language, one way you might detect that they're a non-native speaker is that their placement of stress might be incorrect in pronouncing a word. So they might say computer rather than computer, for example.
Right. Sorry, right. So that was just kind of a little overview of what we spoke about, and I feel like we had a really cool conversation. I kind of want to talk a little bit about as well, because there's a lot of things that we we don't think about as people when we're talking, because it's just like a natural thing. And I feel like one of the examples for that is when you were talking to me about your research regarding teaching kind of the and uhs to a robot. And could you talk a little bit about that part of your research and kind of what you were trying to do there with that machine?
You're right. Yeah. So I think one of the points that I made, and I'm certainly not the first. So there's a famous linguist, psycholinguist, Steven Pinker, who's written a number of books that make concepts and theory in linguistics and psycholinguistics very accessible to the average person, the non-college student, for example. One of his books being The Language Instinct. And in that book, one of his opening chapter goes through and points out all the things that people tend to believe about language that are actually wrong. And one of the ways people's beliefs about languages are wrong is that fillers like uhs and ums are these sort of annoying features of a language, and when in fact they're actually quite important to languages, and all languages have them, not necessarily in the same form. So you and I spoke about how in Spanish the form forms of these pause fillers are slightly different in terms of the vowel sounds. But what is common is that and are, perform an important function, namely they signal a delay in speaking. So, for example, if I called you on the phone and I asked you a question, you literally have about a second in which to respond. And if you don't signal a delay in responding by saying either or then I'm likely to wonder whether, the call got dropped and say, are you there? So we're very sensitive to the timing at which somebody's going to respond in speech, and even within our own speech when we have trouble finding a particular word or whatever, and it's going to disrupt the flow of speech, we signal that using an or an And it also turns out that while not every English speaker will have and in their repertoire, for those that do, there's a difference between when you will use an or an So tends to signal a longer delay than an and again, these are things that people aren't explicitly taught. It's part of acquiring your native language. One of the frustrating things about studying pause fillers is that you begin to pay attention to them, and even in your own speech. And when you pay attention to talking, which you don't ordinarily do, you start disrupting it and causes more uhs and ums.
Right. I guess that's kind of like, in a way, because I told you that, like, I've gotten constructive criticism from a lot of, well, not a lot, but some of my friends that have told me, like, Javi, I really like your show, but you have, like, sometimes you use the word like, for example, with another one a lot. And I feel like kind of maybe that's it's sort of similar to the phone thing, because especially for the episodes that I do when it's just me in the room, I kind of have to let the listeners know that even if I'm still thinking about something, or like even just because I'm not making a point at the moment, I'm still there and it's not like dead air.
Right.
And so that's one of the things that I actually like thought that like was more so like had a different use.
Right. Yeah. So there again, when you ask people, what do you think the use of like, that isn't a lexical use, and by lexical I mean a word. So like can be a verb, right? So the use of like, as in saying it costs like 29 cents. That's called a discourse marker use, and the average person that you ask, what they think like is doing and when it's produced in that way, they'll say things like it's performing a pause filler function like the uhs and ums do, or it's just a reflection of sloppy English or sloppy speech, when in fact it's actually performing an important pragmatic function. So when you ask people what function that might be, they often think, well, it means approximative. So when I say it costs like 29 cents, people say that what I'm saying is it's approximately 29 cents. But that doesn't make sense if you look at quantities of expression that are preceded by like, those quantities tend to be exact. So that's actually not the function that it's doing. What it's doing is it's directing the listener to think of not what the implication is of the exact meaning of the following words is, but rather sort of what the connotation is, or what overall it sort of means to be for whatever the thing is that costs 29 cents, for it to cost 29 cents, as opposed to fixating on the exact amount itself. So it's a difficult sort of function to explain, but it's definitely a function. And then there's another form of like that has seen a dramatic rise in especially spontaneous or conversational speech, and that has a quotative function. By that I mean it introduces reported speech, and it is actually replacing the use of go for that function. So people used to commonly say in casual speech, and I went, "You can't do that," where the past tense of go is being used to introduce reported speech that the speaker, said in some context. What you would more likely see today is people say, and I was like, "You can't do that," and there's a reason why like is actually replacing go in that way, and it has to do with the fact that like, when it's introducing reported speech, and especially first-person reported speech, where it begins with an I said, or I was like, or I went, it's ambiguous as to whether the speaker actually said those words or thought about saying them. So like can be used to convey something that you thought about saying, but you actually didn't say, as well as actually said. Whereas if you use the word said, if I said, and I said, "You can't do that," I had to have actually said it. I couldn't have thought about saying it. And likewise if I said, "I went, you can't do that," then I had to have said it. So because like can be ambiguous in this way about whether you actually thought about saying something or actually did say it, it's useful because it allows speakers to add sort of more drama to the stories that they tell, right? So by leaving it ambiguous as to whether you said something in a particular context that might have been sort of shocking or provocative, or thought about saying it, might heighten the drama of the story that you're telling. And so it's for that reason it's actually increased in its usage. And it's not just English. Other languages have similar forms of like doing the same function or the same pragmatic function. But there again, it's not something that's explicitly taught. Nobody told you that you could use like in that way. We sort of pick it up from its usage in various contexts. And because of it not being explicitly taught, when you ask people, what do you think's going on there, they often don't have accurate, intuitive ideas, unless you're a linguist.
Right. Which is funny because there's also kind of like the opposite, in which like you'll be telling a story and you'll say like I know that it's like I don't think it's in use as much, but it used to be a lot where people would say that something literally happened, mm-hmm. and it like didn't like literally implies that obviously it's like exactly something happened verbatim, but so in that sense it's used like in the opposite. And we do, I feel like, use a lot of words kind of in out of like place, like in give them meanings that we wouldn't originally have them, and I guess that's kind of just like a part of like evolutionary language, like just how we communicate. But it's interesting to see that in the context of like a machine or like a robot, especially with how developed like artificial intelligence is getting now. And like I was having a conversation the other day with one of my friends about like about whether like artificial intelligence or computers or machines will ever be able to think the way that humans can. And I feel like ultimately, even if they can't, they'll, like, the way I see it is artificial intelligence is kind of just trial and error based. It's just like doing something over and over again. And so ultimately it'll get so close to, even if it can, it'll get so close to imitating like emotions and language that we won't be able to tell the difference, I feel like. Right.
Yeah. No. And there's a long history in philosophy and in computer science and in what is now the field of cognitive science, which is an interdisciplinary field, which includes philosophy, computer science, cognitive psychology, linguistics, anthropology. So all those branches of science that have something to do with studying the mind and humans and human behavior. And in the case of computer science, that's where the development of artificial intelligence arose. And in artificial intelligence, a lot of the algorithms that are being used aren't sort of set programs like you might think of in trying to program your computer to do something, but rather the artificial intelligence algorithms are based on sort of a lot of what we know from neuroscience research about the brain, and that is how do we learn? What does it mean to be intelligent? And in general, what it means to be intelligent is the ability to generalize from prior experiences. So so these algorithms are mimicking sort of how humans sort of are able to generalize based on prior experiences. And the greater the experience you have in a domain, sort of the better the expertise you have, because the better you are at accurately generalizing or making predictions. And so that's ultimately sort of the kinds of algorithms that are going to result in, a robot or an artificial agent being able to communicate with somebody in a way that makes it sound like they're an actual person. And then the question, which goes back to Searle and other, philosophers, is to what extent, what is consciousness then, right? What is the capacity to think? If you can design an artificial agent to, basically sound like and act like a human, then where is the difference? Is it simply because it's not a biological basis that's giving rise to that capacity, or is there something different or special? And that is a quintessential question in philosophy of mind, right? And what is the relationship between mind and brain, and is it, is consciousness and thought really an epiphenomena of what is actually happening in the physical substrate of the brain?
Right. You also have I searched. Do you have research kind of on eye movements and like spoken language comprehension?
Right.
So could you talk a little bit about that too? Because I feel like it's also applicable kind of to that setting, in the sense that, like, this is like a very movie-esque depiction of like artificial intelligence, but like I know that like creation of like androids and like people look like machines looking like people, and kind of this future-esque type thing.
Right.
Like, kind of there's a human part in the way we communicate also with our eyes and our face. And I guess I guess that's what I want you to talk about a little bit, is like, how does eye movement correlate with like comprehending language and that type of stuff?
Right, yeah. So in some earlier work, which was back in the 90s, that I did with some colleagues at the University of Rochester when I was a postdoctoral researcher there, we developed what is now being referred to as the visual worlds paradigm, where we had what it was called a free head eye tracking device. So this was a little headband that people wore, and it had a camera on it that would capture an infrared image of the eye, and then it was attached to a long cord that connected to a control unit interface with the computer. And so we would use the infrared image of the eye to track its degree of rotation in the eye socket. And by that I mean sort of where it's pointed. And we would do a mapping procedure where we had people look at 9-point coordinates that were known in the world, and we could map then the position of their eye. And the output of all of this was a video that came from a head cam also attached to the headband, showing sort of the world as viewed from the perspective of the person wearing the eye tracker. And then superimposed were these crosshairs, the intersection of which showed where in that world they were looking at any given moment in time. And eyes are useful as a behavioral measure because they often reflect where our attention is. And so we thought this would be a great tool to study spoken language comprehension, which notoriously at that point had been difficult to study because there were no good behavioral measures to do so. Whereas eye tracking had been used at that point quite a bit in reading. So you put an eye tracker on somebody and have them read a sentence and look at their fixations across the sentence. In this case, we were doing this with spoken sentences, and so we had people perform a task where we gave them instructions to pick up and move objects around on a table. So pick up the candy and put it above the cup. And we video recorded this, and then we would go back to the video recording, and we would look for the frame at which the k of candy began. And then we would see how many frames or how much time elapsed before the person looked at candy via the eye movement record prior to reaching for it. And that then gave us a measurement of how long it took the comprehension process, the speech comprehension process, to map the spoken word candy onto the referent in the world. And what we found was that people's eye movements were going very shortly after the offset of the E part of candy. And we know that it takes about 200 milliseconds to program an eye movement. So if we subtract that time, people were looking at the candy at about the duh, right? So it remarkably fast. So given that initial discovery, we applied this technique to looking at a whole range of issues that have been of interest in psycholinguistics in terms of comprehension. So for example, how to resolve what's called a syntactic ambiguity. So if I say, put the apple on the towel in the box, right, that I might be telling you to put the apple that's on the towel in the box, or I might be telling you, put the apple on the towel that's in the box. And so it's ambiguous as to where the towel is and its relationship to the box. And so we were able to look at how people's eye movements, when asked to perform that with real-world objects, reflected the difficulty in sorting out which interpretation was correct, and how the context, that is, the arrangement of the objects on the table, were being used in real time, so as they were hearing the sentence, to disambiguate it. And that, in turn, actually led to a very important publication in Science that really launched this whole visual world paradigm that's now become quite commonly used to study spoken language comprehension. Since that time, I've actually applied the eye movement recording technique to looking at not so much comprehension of speech, but how people interact in face-to-face conversations or storytelling situations. So we know that in Western cultures, at least, the typical situation when two people are talking face-to-face is that while the speaker is talking, the listener maintains their fixation on the speaker's face, but the speaker may look away and look back and look away and look back. And when they look back, that's typically going to coincide with a turn in exchange. So when I'm ready to give up the floor, I will look back at you, and then it's your turn to take the floor. And then I would maintain gaze on your face, and you might look away and look back and look away and look back. So I was interested in a storytelling situation where there's not a lot of turn taking. Why is it our speakers looking away and looking back at their listeners' faces? And what I found was one trigger of them looking away seems to be when they're having difficulty finding words or planning an utterance, because about 98% of the occurrences of uhs and ums in their speech coincided with a look away from their addressees or their listeners' faces. And in addition, when they look back, there was this tight coupling in terms of the listener providing feedback of their understanding in the form of head nods. So speakers would look back at the listener's face, and the listener would begin head nodding, which you all can't see, but Javier is doing right now. And then that would trigger a look away again. So there was this sort of unconscious sort of dance that was taking place between where the speaker is looking and what the listener is doing to signal non-verbally and as well as verbally in the forms of their understanding of what's going on, and speakers have to monitor that. So if I look back and if Javier's eyebrows are furrowed and he's looking confused, I will take into account that and rephrase what I'm saying to try to address what appears to be failure to understand. Or if I look back and he's off looking, in some far corner of the room and not at me, I might be wondering what is distracting his attention, because again, where the eyes are tend to indicate, at least in Western cultures, where our attention is, and that's why we might perceive it rude if you're talking to someone and they're not looking back at you when you look at them. Although there are conditions where we excuse it. So for example, when you're eating and you're sitting across each other, then it's perfectly acceptable if you look at your listener and they're not looking back at you because they're trying to cut their piece of steak with their knife.
Right. So, I mean, I have a few questions about that, I guess. So for one, do you ever get a little kind of self-aware having studying all this, when you're having conversations with people? Do you ever kind of notice these things, like start or like, because I know that, for example, I mean, this kind of applies to different like fields, but for example, like when I play the bass, and when a lot of times, like, people will tell you, even in, this is just like theatrics or like performance arts, it's like if you mess up, no one will know, because no one knows how the piece goes, or no one knows like the intricate details. And so, but once you start kind of getting into it, you'll be able to like pinpoint like more mistakes in musical pieces, like live performances or such. So do you ever like get a little like self, like kind of you see things that people don't, in terms of like when you're having conversations with other people?
Yeah, well, I think I'm more self-aware about my own speech and patterns than I am about other people's per se. Although I will say that probably most faculty or anybody else who's been sort of in a mentoring relationship for students will know that when somebody's kind of nervous and they're standing up and they're giving an oral presentation, you might be a little bit more purposeful as an audience member in sort of using head nods and nonverbal feedback as encouragement and smiling and making them more relaxed. Whereas usually that sort of nonverbal feedback is mostly spontaneous. But that would be an example of where I might be more consciously performing those sort of actions to help the student or the speaker along who appears to be a little bit nervous. But most of my research is involves trying to collect in a laboratory setting as naturalistic as possible sort of interactions between people, and then going back and looking at the videos and annotating them as well as transcribing the speech and annotating that as well for features. Speech happens so rapidly, and once you start paying attention to things that you don't ordinarily pay attention to, you often will screw it up.
Right.
So, and a lot of my early training as a graduate student was looking at speech errors. And so one problem I have, and anybody who's taken my course will attest to this, is that if I make a speech error, I often stop for a moment and have to sort of think about it because I find it interesting, and then I lose my train of thought.
Right. So I know like psychology in general is kind of a new field. And I assume that because of that, psycholinguistics would be too. I was wondering kind of what got you interested in like the field in the first place, kind of like what sparked your curiosity about it. I was an undergraduate at the University of Rochester in Rochester, New York, and I had intended to major in clinical psychology, and I happened to take a course in cognitive psychology and just became fascinated with sort of the experimental techniques and the research questions about just how the mind works. And the University of Rochester has an excellent linguistics department, and some, especially at that time, very notable psycholinguists at whom I had the privilege of taking courses from, and just developed a passion for it. And ironically, I'm not a bilingual, so I know a little bit of French, a little bit of Italian, a little bit of German, but I wouldn't say I'm proficient in any of those languages. Whereas a lot of my research these days has involved or looked at issues pertaining to bilingualism and all the benefits that come from bilingualism, and the fact that that more and more people are becoming bilingual, particularly in Europe, and the benefits from that. So you and I had talked about that before, that just the act of having to translate from one language to another, and the realization that some things are easier said in other languages, or even though you may have a word that is the translation equivalent of the word in another language,
sometimes it's not exactly the same in meaning, and there's a benefit to that in terms of sort of realizing that the world really isn't black and white, but it's kind of fuzzy and gray, especially in terms of interpretation and meaning. And that sort of awareness, I think, promotes more open-mindedness, as well as being very categorical in your perceptions.
Right. We were talking about that a lot too, about how in different languages, in my case, English and Spanish, there tend to be like kind of cultural, I guess, ways of saying things in ways that, for one example that we used was, can you open the door, or can you please open the door?
Right.
Which obviously, like, you can, but it's kind of like a way to make things more polite in that sense. And how in like, for example, I use the example of my mom, who, like, she can understand English fairly well, but she has some troubles like speaking it. It's sometimes it's the kind of cultural side of things that she has a harder time understanding, even though she like can understand it like really well, but or not understanding, but when she's trying to convey like a message, the kind of the structuring and the phrasing, like when I'll help her translate something to someone else, it'll usually be, I'll usually say it in a very different way. Like, I know what she means or what she's trying to say, but
Right.
I'll convey it in a very different way.
Right, yeah, and that actually goes back to an important distinction that Paul Grice, a famous philosopher / linguist, made back in the 70s between saying versus conveying. So saying is sort of the literal meaning of the word. So in the example, can you open the door? The literal meaning is a yes or no question about the listener's capability of opening a door. And in a context where it's clear the person is capable, they have two functioning arms and they're within close proximity to the door, that question is ridiculous, right? So why would I be asking about your capability of opening a door when I can see that you are capable of opening it? And that sort of blatant violation of sort of what we would deem to be rational in a conversation, that is, not asking nonsensical questions, leads to what is called an implicature, and that is what the actual intended meaning is of that utterance. And that's not what the literal meaning is, but rather there's another meaning. And in this example, the meaning is really a command, open the door. If the speaker had said that, because commands carry an expectation that the listener is going to comply without, and if they didn't, there'd be some negative consequence. And in a situation where the speaker and the listener are pretty equal in status, that extra expectation that comes with a command is what makes it rude. And so that's what causes speakers then to use this indirect form of a command, like, can you open the door? And because it's technically ambiguous as to whether it's really intended as a command or as a request. The request version being, will you open the door? And because the speaker can say, oh no, I meant it as a request, not a command, right? Or because it's simply ambiguous, it makes it polite. And English speakers recognize that this is a conventionalized, almost an idiomatic way of issuing a polite command to use this can you. And one way you can tell that it is a command or a request and not a literal question, a yes-no question, is if you insert please with it, if it makes sense. So if I say, can you open the door, please, then clearly it's not intended to be a literal yes or no question about your capability. Compare that to if I say, can you lift 50 pounds, please, right? As soon as I add please, I'm turning it into a command or a request, and whereas, which might be kind of strange, and because it makes more sense for me to be literally asking about your capability of lifting a sizable amount of weight. So one of the difficulties that happens then when trying to translate from one language to the next is recognizing instances where it's not the literal meaning that's intended intended by the speaker, not what is being said, but what the speaker intends to convey. So, and implicatures, again, aren't something that you get explicitly taught in your native language, but we are very adept at deriving them and conveying them as speakers of our native language. And so if you're not a native speaker of the language, it is one potential source of confusion. And this has also been clearly recognized in domains. We talked about this, legal domains. So, for example, an officer who pulls over a driver who may not be a native English speaker and says, can I see your license and registration, and then can I search your trunk, right? So, is it a literal question? Is it intended to be a command? Is it intended to be, a request that can be refused without negative consequences? So those situations can have even greater implications for misunderstanding.
Right. And one example for that was that I remember I mentioned as well was that I take a international relations class, and we were studying the financial crisis of 2008, and that was like a big contributor to a lot of like the mortgages that were given out at the time, was that a lot of the people that got the mortgages weren't like fluent English speakers. So I mean, I guess it's interesting to see kind of as well how it plays out with history as well. Another example I remember was how I was telling you about how I'm from Puerto Rico, and in Spanish, and especially in Puerto Rico, not everyone's like this, but it's kind of, two things. Number one is that it's, in Spanish, it's like curse words are used a little bit more like flexibly, and they're not seen as like from a cultural standpoint. I'll speak to, at least in Spanish in Puerto Rico, like we'll use a lot of words, like for example, curse words that amongst friends are like terms of endearment. And the other thing is that because I consider English and Spanish to be like both my first languages, but I did live for most of my life in a place where Spanish was the predominant language, and I'd only speak like English with my friends, even though I spoke it every day. It wasn't like I went to the grocery store and I spoke in Spanish, So it wasn't like I was speaking English outside of like my friend group. So most of like the language also that I've realized that it's one thing to learn the language, and then you kind of have your own like language style and how you talk and how you speak, and how for me, I consumed a lot of media to help me learn when I was younger, and as I grew older, I obviously kept Puerto Rico is also fairly Americanized, so we have a lot of American media. Most of the media we consume, I would say, comes from the U.S., but essentially, like a lot of present day media also has a lot of like curse words and is like not very like PG in that sense. So here at Notre Dame, amongst my friends, like I'll probably curse like more so than a lot of my friends, and I've had conversations with this about them where it's like it's a different thing, because also like for them, they grew up in a setting in which these words carried a lot more weight than they did for me, because I just saw them on TV and obviously it's not a thing that I do like frequently or in every setting, but occasionally like you can tell kind of the difference where I'll like if you have a conversation with me and my friends, like in a friendly, more an amicable setting, it'll be like you can tell the differences and at the beginning of the semester sometimes like it's like a not exactly a culture shock in a heavy way, but it's a different thing, because like back home, like I'll use curse words with my friends, but also occasionally like my parents, and my parents will use them with me, and it's not like a negative connotation in any way. That's just kind of how we express ourselves and how we we talk. And so in that translation, some of it can seem like different when you come to a place where it's completely different. And especially like I feel like it also depends like where you're from, because some people come from families that you can't curse whatsoever. I know that the same way in the US, like some families are also a lot more relaxed on that type of stuff. So it depends a lot on, but especially it's interesting for me to see how like those two parallel and the cultural implications that exist kind of in language. A lot of that has to, I feel like a lot of that also contributes to how kind of interactions and things play out, and a lot of misunderstandings can come out of it. Not that I've had any personal experiences with it, but I know that like I've noticed also that it's not just like Hispanics in Puerto Rico. We have our own kind of subset of like, for example, curse words that we'll use, and I've spoken to other people from the like Latino community that also like people from Mexico or people from Colombia or like I have friends from even that go here to Notre Dame that are from like a bunch of different countries in South America as well, or across the Caribbean, or from Mexico that also use different like variations on curse words, but it's kind of also, it's different because in that community you kind of like get used to like hearing to it. You can almost kind of tell where someone's from based on not only their accent but like the like curse words or the language that they use when they refer, like when like they speak in reference to you or to someone else. So like that type of stuff is pretty interesting as well. I was wondering as well, like, what kind of research are you working on now?
Well, now I have a couple of projects. One is looking at coordination between individuals performing a goal-directed task. So looking at what makes communication efficient versus inefficient in that case. And it's actually an extension of a study that was part of a multi-university research initiative grant that I worked on with some colleagues that was funded by the Department of Defense and had the overall aim of equipping robots with a better ability to understand natural language. So the Department of Defense is very interested in developing robots where you could say, go in that building and search for wounded, as opposed to the state of the art right now where you are driving a drone-like robot. And so we had devised a task that was kind of similar, where we had two individuals talking to each other remotely over a telephone connection, a hands-free telephone connection, and one person was a director and the other person was a searcher. And the director had a floor plan map of a search environment that had target objects scattered throughout it, and those objects had various tasks that had to be performed within a time limit. And the searcher was in the environment, and they only communicated over the phone, so they couldn't see each other, and they were both unfamiliar with the environment prior to the study. So they had to sort of establish what is called common ground, and that goes back to what you were just talking about, where by virtue of the language that a person is using, you can make assumptions about what your shared knowledge might be with that person, your shared experiences, and that's very important for communicating effectively. And so, in general, establishing common ground is important. And in this task, sort of the director had to figure out where the searcher was, and they had to coordinate on that in order for the director to give sensible directions. And likewise, when the searcher found a target object, that they had to report back to the director to indicate where on the map it was found. They had to be accurate and coordinate with the director with respect to where their location was and did it match with where the director thought they were. So we've been annotating the transcriptions of the dialogue for these features, and the task was designed to have, I think there were 16 boxes that had tasks that had to be performed with them. So we could actually score performance, and there was a 20-minute time limit. So we had a range of performance by various dyads, and the dyads that we recruited were strangers, so they didn't even know each other beforehand, which is a whole other dimension of trying to sort of coordinate in terms of establishing mutual shared knowledge that is accurate. And so given a range in performance where some people may have a score of 2 versus managed to do all of the tasks in the 20 minutes and a maximum score of 16, we're able to look at how their communication differed. So where did they fail to establish common ground accurately? And that was often because the searcher was in a location that was not where the director thought that person was, and or the director was misreading the map and confusing the searcher who's in the actual environment where the director was saying that there ought to be physical landmarks that actually didn't exist. And so there'd be a lot of discussion trying to resolve the discrepancies, which was eating up time and hence reducing their performance in that task. So that's one project, and that project actually we did over the summer. And another project, I'm using the eye tracker to study spoken word recognition, where people see a grid on a computer screen that has drawings of common objects that will appear in various cells, and then they hear recordings of words that name those objects, and they simply use the mouse to click on the objects as quickly as possible. And we're measuring their eye movements as they do this task, again to look at how long it takes them to map the spoken word onto the referent in the world. So I have a couple of undergraduates who are working with me on that task as well. And I have another task looking at individual differences in learning what I call long-distance dependencies, which is a hallmark of languages, like subject-verb agreement is an example of long-distance dependency. So if I say, the blanket on the babies is blue, the agreement between the singular noun blanket and the verb is linking the relationship between the predicate is blue to that noun phrase, the blanket, and not to babies, which is good because we don't want the babies to be blue. So languages use agreement, some more so than others, to link in a stream of sequential words what are otherwise simultaneous conceptual or thought dimensions, right? So a blanket is simultaneously a blanket and in its color, say blue, but I can't convey that in words simultaneously. I have to do it in an ordered way, and so that's how agreement works. So given that this is a hallmark feature, some recent work has shown that there's individual differences in sort of implicit or incidentally learning non-contiguous dependencies in nonsense words, and I'm interested in what might underlie those individual differences. And one hypothesis has to do with hemispheric dominance, so whether left hemisphere versus right hemisphere is dominant as reflected in handedness. I have preliminary data showing that there is a correlation between incidental learning of these non-adjacent dependencies or long-distance dependencies and the extent to which you're strongly right-handed or not. So I hope there are plans to collect a whole lot of data in a very large sample by running the study using Amazon's Mechanical Turk. So that's three somewhat different studies going on in the lab, and that sort of span a range of my interests right now.
That's pretty interesting because I'm left-handed.
Yeah.
So I've always really been kind of intrigued by left-handedness, and this is something I could make even a whole episode about. But I know that only 10% of people on the planet are left-handed, and the numbers are decreasing. And I know there is a correlation to handedness and the side of your brain that is more dominant, I guess. But yeah, that's pretty cool. In your first research, the one about the robots going into search for the wounded, or I guess that would be one potential use for it. But so you mentioned that the thing that people are having most trouble with in sense of communication is direction based, right?
Yeah. And so, if you can't keep track of where the searcher is, or if you think the searcher, if you're the director and you think the searcher's at one location when they're actually not, obviously there's a misalignment, and that's going to create confusion and disrupt the effectiveness of the communication. And there are a lot of nuances that contribute to these sorts of things. So, if you tell the person to, several of the pairs of subjects that we recruited tried to adopt a strategy whereby they agreed up front that, I'm going to refer to the ends of the building. This was actually run in Corbett Hall, which is a really long rectangular sort of building, and it was on just one of the floors. And so there was this agreement, okay, so I'm going to direct you, with respect to north and south ends of the halls, and which is a helpful strategy in that situation, because the director's map didn't have room numbers on it, so they couldn't use that as a landmark. And there's a lot of rooms or areas along Corbett Hall, especially on the third floor, that look very similar to each other. So there weren't distinct landmarks per se that were helpful, other than sort of big rooms like a lounge or classroom and that. So the director had to be pretty good about adopting the the searcher's perspective, and especially in helping them find a hidden target object someplace. So they would often coordinate by telling the searcher, well, it should be on your right or on your left, and the director would have to do this from, for example, a 2D floor plan. So they would have to envision themselves embedded in a 3D environment that the searcher was in order to give instructions that way. If you didn't adopt the searcher's perspective, then you might give the instruction with respect to landmark cues in the area. So there should be a table in that room, and the target object should be under the table, right? Rather than saying straight in front of you and on the floor should be the target objects, which would be the searcher's perspective base. So we've been interested in looking at the ability of the director to adopt the searcher's perspective when giving directions, and whether that facilitated the searcher's ability to find boxes as well as report the locations of boxes back to the director.
Right. So what has been I guess that's the most you mentioned it, the purpose behind it is to find what makes language efficient and inefficient. Mm-hmm. So I guess inefficiency would be kind of the lack of being there, obviously, and having to put yourself in the position of that person. What do you think would be the most efficient, the most efficient strategy so far?
Adopting the other person's perspective, especially in the case of the director, so it's a little bit more difficult for the searcher to adopt this director's perspective, who's looking at a two-dimensional floor plan map. But insofar as the director could envision the searcher embedded in the environment and what it would look like from their perspective in terms of, in front of and to the right and to the left and up and down, right. Then that's helpful. Another feature was, for example, one of the tasks involved the searcher trying to find a target object and then report its location back to the director, who then had to mark the location of the object on the map. And what we found is that when the searcher does that, if the searcher gives the description in this one long stream of speech, so I found the white box and it was by the chair near the window, and it was actually under the chair in the room where, it's called the lounge. that almost always resulted in the director forcing the searcher to stop and repeat incrementally. So the best way to give a complex description or instruction in a remote situation like this is to do it piecemeal. So searchers that instead would say, so I went into the room that's called the lounge, and they would often end with this sort of rising intonation, almost questioning, which would elicit what you just did, and that is, feedback which is called a continuer on the part of the director, who would say, and then they go, and there's a chair over by the window, and the director would go, and below that chair is a white box, and then the director would go, okay. And so another interesting annotation of our transcriptions concerns what are called acknowledgments and their forms of them, which can be in the form of okay, all right, right, yeah, yep, yes.
Yeah, so I guess like kind of conciseness would be useful in that. So we're narrowing down to the last minute, so I want to take this time to do the outro. And thank you very much for coming on the show. You are my first professor and a person of higher knowledge that has been on the show, which I'm very excited to, because I do want to keep continue to do the show, especially into the next semester. And I guess it's a good first season finale for the first season of the Way podcast. As for the listeners, I'm trying to book Marcelo once again to talk about the second episode of Puerto Rican independence, and that's going to be fun as well. But thank you very much for coming on the show and for sharing your research with us. It's very interesting. I think this is a field that, like I mentioned, is pretty new, but it's cool to also put it out to people, because I definitely think it'll it can spark interest, and this is something that I've been wondering, I have a lot of questions about in the past. But yeah, so narrowing down here to the last 10 seconds, I'm going to say goodbye to the audience. Thank you very much for listening. Stay tuned for future episodes, and this has been The Way with Maps. I'm your host, Maps. Thanks for listening.